I'm an abolitionist at my core, but I also work in law, right? So it's very interesting. But I also think that like in order to abolish something, you must first master it. And so for me, I understand that there are going to be generations of lawyers that are coming out of school and they're being taught a white supremacist narrative of what tradition, history, culture, precedent, right? Even what has a legal standing and can be viewed by justices or judges is, right? And I have to disrupt that because I have the knowledge to do that. And so I don't really see myself as really necessarily working within a system. The question for me is always, where do you disrupt it, right? And so I'm always trying to expose the law for the lies it tells. And I always ask the question when I'm in class with my students, and tonight I'm teaching advanced critical race theory, but I always ask them, okay, so here's the law, where's the lie? Like whose lives are being lied about? Who's being erased here? And what are the stakes?
The Grow Dialogue podcast is a liberation project that explores equity, inclusion, belonging, conflict resolution, and culture in the workplace and beyond, including in our personal relationships, families, and communities. Each week, my co-host, Mariella Marie, and I will bring you insightful guest interviews and artistic expressions curated to amplify emerging voices who are sharing practices that support society's transition to a more collaborative, just, sustainable, and liberating coexistence. We live during a time when divisiveness and polarization dominate the social, economic, and political discourse. In response to this reality, and empowered with the skills of authentic dialogue and systems thinking, I created an anti-oppression framework for social sustainability called Theory of Indivisibility to help illuminate a different path forward. Our hope is that these conversations and calls to action will ignite tolerance and empathy and provide guidance for our global listeners who want to actively engage in ending all forms of oppression while creating thriving relationships in the workplace and beyond. I'm Dr. Sundiata. Let's grow dialogue. All right, here we are. Anansi, Dr. Anansi, thank you for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to finally make it.
Yes, the people need to hear your voice. And I know that you get an opportunity to do that often, but through this platform, we're going to spread your message and who you are with even a broader audience. So again, I'm just excited that you agreed to be here to share your voice with the Grow Dialogue audience and listeners. And what I like to do to start with all of my guests is ask the question, who are you? How do you define yourself?
I always tell everyone first that I am a child of Latoya and a grandchild of Willamay and a great-grandchild of Elamay. I think that so much of the work that I do, both in my professional academic life, as an organizer, as a lawyer, as a law professor, as a partner, right, as a community member, comes down to the lessons I've given by my mother and my grandmothers, right? So I think that in many ways, a lot of my work is what, Professor Christina Sharp would call care work. And how do you make sure that you're engaging in the caring and tending to of Black folks and Black lives? I mean, so often we hear this stuff like, Black Lives Matter and, all this, but like, what does it mean to like make Black lives more than just mere matter, right? Just something that you merely consider or merely the kind of makeup, of atoms and flesh? What does it mean to actually tend to Black living, right? As opposed to responding to the threat of Black dying. And so I think that's what my work is about, whether it's, writing poetry or essays or law review articles, or, being in a court or, being on the news and kind of explicating these issues from a kind of Black queer perspective. I'm from Kansas City, Kansas side, the land of true barbecue. I know everyone else likes to have their barbecue, but, the real truth is in Kansas City.
Okay. And how would you say your upbringing has, or growing up in Kansas City? You also mentioned your mother and your grandmother is a deep part of how you define yourself. Can you just share a little bit how your upbringing in Kansas City and these two women's influence on you have impacted who you are today?
Yeah, so I grew up both in Kansas City and then in like Southeast Kansas and rural Kansas, a town of like I would say 7,000 people. Everybody there that was Black was my cousin, and that was half of the town. So it was a very different experience than moving to the city when I was older, maybe like 12 or 13. But single parent home. My mother had me when she was 17. Definitely had a lot of struggles with domestic violence and also drug dependency. And people talk a lot about people that are addicted to drugs, but I always try to step back and say like, what is the world that we've created that people need drugs to escape it, right? And so drugs oftentimes operate as a type of self-care and not a deficit of someone's morality or their character. So I try to always, state that when I'm talking about my mother and other people. But because of my mom was dealing with this and dealing with abuse, I ended up raising my 3 younger siblings for the most part. And then, also being raised, and not just by my grandmother and my great-grandmother. It was so great to have that many different generations in the same town, but also my great aunts and my great-great aunts and my first cousin. Right. And we're all in the same town. You're running around, to come home when the street lights come on. Maybe your mom didn't see you, but your Aunt Pearl around the corner saw you and you better get your little self home. So there was that type of community always there for me. And so, for me, that really instantiated this idea of like, what does care look like? And what does it mean to have regard, not just for the Black folks that are related to you, but Black people because they're human beings. And I got that type of deep rearing from like the sensitivity of my mom, regardless of what she was going through, kind of give her the shirt off her back, but also the pragmatism of my grandmother, Willamette. She wasn't a religious person. She wasn't about that at all. She was very involved with like Black power movements and things, but her thing was like, how do you get power? Power is how you get free. As long as you're not stepping on anyone's neck to do that, you're doing the right work. So just having those different generations and having it being women-led, women that weren't concerned about, my sexuality or my gender, they cared about how do you feel, right? What's your opinion? And being asked your opinion at 5 years old, I think is something that is truly liberatory for Black children. Oftentimes we're told to be seen and not heard. And so the fact that I was demanded to speak and required to memorize Langston Hughes and then recite it and then critique it, told me what it meant to have an opinion and how important that was, at the age of 5, 6, 7 years old.
I think that's amazing. That so at a young age, your voice was cultivated. You were encouraged to exercise your voice, to use your voice. Unfortunately, a lot of young people, as you said, they're told to be seen but not heard, stay in a child's place, etc. But it sounds like you have some really, some people in your life who really empowered you and encouraged you to pull that out of you.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even just say encouraged. I would say demanded. Right?
Okay, it's that is different. That's a different energy.
Yeah, it's like, how dare you be silent? Did you not see what happened? Did you not bear witness? What's your testimony? And it was just this idea that like, you've come out of my daughter's womb. We've worked this many hours to make sure you go to school. So when you go out into this world, you're a representation of us and every ancestor that came before you. So you will know Langston Hughes. You will know James Baldwin. The first book you read will be I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing. And I want a chapter by chapter breakdown, and you're gonna tell me all about it in your 5-year-old mind. We'll revisit this at 7 and then again at 12. But it was just that demand that like my grandmother always knew that I'm not always going to be there to speak for you, and you're the first grandchild. So what you going to do?
Right. Wow. So you were definitely, they had a vision for you and they helped to mold you in an intentional way. And that's pretty awesome. And even through the struggles that you share with your mother and with drug abuse and everything, you still had enough supportive community around you that could still cultivate your intellect. In spite of some of those challenges that you spoke to, experiencing and seeing as well. I think that's amazing. And, as I listen to your story, I can relate in the sense that I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I grew up in a big city. However, my father was from Apalachicola, Florida, which is a small town on the panhandle of Florida, like you explained that you grew up in. So every summer, I would literally leave the big city, drive with my family down south, and spend a month or two in Apalachicola, where, like you said, half the town was my cousins and family, etc. So I got to straddle both of those worlds, as a young person growing up. So I could definitely relate, and I could definitely relate to strong women, in my life with my grandmother. But I also had my grandfather, who was a strong influence on me as well. So one of the things I noticed in your story is that you mentioned a bunch of women who were strong influences on your life. So I'm curious, did you also have any strong, male figures in that family space as well?
Yeah, so it's different, and I won't say that the men weren't, strong. And I mean, we can define what that means in many
Yeah,
ways, right?
I noticed that as I said that, but I'll let you
Yeah,
continue.
but it's interesting because the women, when I mentioned my mother's the oldest, but she has five younger brothers.
Okay.
Right? And my grandmother is the middle child, but she has mostly sisters, and then her brothers are all younger than her. And then my great grandmother has like five brothers, but again, she's the oldest. So it's different because like the women are also the elders. There's something else going on here. And my uncles were men of few words, but large actions. They worked. You know what I mean? My grandmother would purchase a house, and all of my uncles would go with my grandmother, and my grandmother too, would remodel the place and flip it, right? Buy these little $10,000 shacks in rural Kansas, sell it for 50,000 or 100,000, and then spread it out among the family. So the men, they didn't really have a lot of opinions as much as they would share about things, but they were more so about like, we will do the work, and we're going to teach you how to fix anything. So when something happens, you don't got to call nobody white. You don't got to have money to get by. So it was like a different type of utilitarian thing. Whereas like the women were more intellectual.
Okay. So and further, when I say it's strong, and when I think about that, in my mind, I'm thinking about like a strong influence on me. Mm-hmm. When I use the word strong, and I appreciate you pulling that out in terms of allowing me to elaborate on what I meant by strong. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather, so he was just, he was that presence. He was that very overarching presence, not only in our family but also in the whole town, because he was the principal of the black school during segregation, and then when integration happened in that small town, he became the principal of the integrated schools as well. And then he went on to be, and it was one school in the town, one elementary school and one high school. Mm-hmm. And so for him to have that role, he was kind of this large figure throughout the whole town, and he demanded respect in every area in that way. And, so when I say strong, I mean like a strong influence in that way. Mm-hmm. Education was really big in my family as well because of that, on that side of family, at least. So yeah, I definitely am tracking, how that age, dynamic plays a role, could have played a role in your family as well. So let me ask you this, you mentioned the women in your family being supportive of your sexuality. How do you identify in terms of your sexuality?
I definitely identify as, a Black queer person. People might just say queer. I say Black queer. It's a term that I coined when I was in college. Spell it BLAQUEER. Just because for me, there's not really a separation or a space where my race and sexuality depart, right? We talk a lot, and I know we're going to get more into kind of like the work and the intellectual things later, but we talk a lot about this notion of intersectionality. And my problem with intersectionality isn't that it isn't a brilliant theory. It's just this idea that for somehow my identities and the things that impact them are meeting at an intersection of a road, like they just met each other. You know what I mean? But in reality, this has always been me. They've always been co-forming. I just got the language. You know what I mean? So there isn't a place where I arrived that, okay, I identify as Black and now I identify as queer. Whether I identified or not, this was the reality that's co-forming the ways in which I'm read in the world. Sure. So definitely identify as a Black queer person, and specifically Black, because queerness can be weird too.
Okay, definitely going to come back to that. Definitely want to come a little deeper on that. So, but before we go there, I want to ask, like, in terms of your evolution in a world that I grew up in, a world that wasn't open, that wasn't kind to people who identified as queer, gay, or just say LGBTQ plus, anywhere on that spectrum. So I'm curious, if you're comfortable sharing, was it hard coming into that knowing at a young age and gaining acceptance in your family dynamics, or were you supported pretty much throughout?
It was definitely hard to start. It was kind of, I would say, almost like a bifurcated experience. So when I was living with my grandmother, even when I wasn't living with her, she would always tell me every morning, every night, I'll love you forever and ever and always. As soon as I woke up in the morning and before I went to bed. And, people would ask, are they gay? They have a little sugar in their tank, yada, yada, yada. And my grandmother would just be like, it doesn't really matter. You trying to sleep with my 5-year-old grandchild? Like, what you trying to, you know what I mean? So there was always that check. But it was also, my grandmother was always like, if you have something to tell me, because it's not going to impact any way that I deal with you. But like, I think that for me, more of the struggle was internal. And I think this is a lot for Black people too, that, we weren't even really raised in the church, but the church's influence was so heavy. My great aunt, Lavon, my grandmother's older sister, was very much in the kind of evangelical, tongue speaking world. And so she would always be like trying to take me down to the altar, and you pray the gay away and oil and all of this. And I didn't really know what was going on. I was too young, maybe second third grade. But, you know, as my mother started to really struggle and I moved in with her in Kansas City with drugs, you know, I joined the church myself. I got ordained at 14. Other gay boys, Black kids, we had met on High Five and tagged online. And there was about 50 of us. We literally had a prayer line where we were trying to be like, God, how do we be our full selves while also not like going to hell? And it's the kind of whole thorn in the flesh type of thing. But by 15, I was just like done with that foolishness. I was like, I got my full scholarship. I'm out of here. But at the time, at first, it was hard for my mom. My mom's bigger thing was like, I don't want you to get AIDS and die. But it was a point where I didn't talk to my mother for a full year because she just couldn't accept it. And I was like, I'm not going to be emotionally cannibalized in this way. But after that, it literally was like, even my homophobic drug dealing uncles became my biggest offenders. You know what I mean? And so now I'll go home and it'll be like, someone will say, you know, the F word this, F word that, and my uncles will be like, wait, what? Or my little cousins will like be trying to fight for me. I'm like, listen, it's not that. Listen, I understand how Black people talk. I understand it's offensive to some folks, but like, I'm good. I don't need nobody to fight for me.
So that's good to know. So it sounds like you basically kind of knew this and accepted this about yourself, except that you were queer at a very young age. And then the process of your family accepting you, you know, emerged over time as well. To the point where it became like your biggest, you know, supporters and advocates. And I love to hear it, you know. I know it can be fearful. I have people in my life right now who are still afraid to come out to their parents, and, you know, for fear of being shunned, etc. And one of the things that I always felt, and I'm totally empathetic, and I can understand why someone would want to protect themselves in that way. But one of the things that I always believed was, you know, by coming out, it gives our family an opportunity to empathize and learn and open their minds to these things in ways that they may not be forced to if they're not confronted with someone they love identifying differently than what generally is the culturally accepted norms around, you know, sexuality and gender and all these various things. You know, so, and it sounds like that's what happened, you know, with your family. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to some extent. I'm just thinking too about like what you were saying. And I also feel like, particularly if you come out and you're like a queer person, like your gender embodiment doesn't look like the so-called normal straight man or a straight woman or what have you, I think it does something even more powerful. So I realized that like with my family, especially my uncles, after I came out, they were much more free to talk about their emotions around me. There wasn't this kind of like masculine threat that I got to be a man around you and do this and that. Like they would tell me how they feel. They ask me for advice. Like the same thing, even more so with my aunts. You know what I mean? And so and my family has always had a kind of queerness to it because it's a woman-run family. And so that means that women aren't just cooking and cleaning, they're also hunting and shooting. Right? You know what I mean? My grandmother's the best shot in the family. And so when you add that onto it, like what is this idea of a male that's a patriarch and protector when the women are the better shooters? So it completely changes the whole ordeal, right? So I think something happened there. And I think that also me being queer with this like different gender embodiment, you know, if I want to wear a crop top, I'll do that in rural Kansas at home. If I want to wear some little hoochie daddy shorts, I'll do that too. I think that has allowed the men and the women to also question the ways in which they repress their gender presentation. They might be straight as hell, for lack of better terms. But now my uncle feels okay with having his little tight shorts on and having his thighs out. You know what I mean? Because he's been shown that like, actually, I don't have to show up this way. And I think that sometimes it's really hard for people to accept you because then they have to look back and think about what are the ways in which I've been policed as a child? Who did it to me? Like, how do I now relate to my mother and father because I got my butt whooped because I was playing with dolls or I wanted to paint my nails or I was a tomboy? And like, so now how do you think about that? Or how do you think about the way that you discipline your nieces or nephews or your children? And so I think sometimes it's hard for people to accept someone being queer or having a freer gender embodiment because it then forces them to deal with the ways in which they police themselves and they've policed others, and the people that they love the most might have caused them the most harm. So I think there's a lot of like subconscious things that are going on there that if you accept me as a true free human being that has a valid identity, then what does that mean for yours?
Man, so many things, so many powerful things that you said within there. So many things around the ways that patriarchy and let's say masculinity, more so like toxic masculinity impacts, you know, us and those who identify as men, cisgender, you know, heterosexual males, that even if they identify as that, in terms of like gender identification and expression and all these things can show up on a spectrum that have nothing to do with your sexuality. And I feel like people are starting to accept that, embrace those variations and you know, the complexities around those things. And I love hearing that, you know, your uncles, you know, felt more comfortable, you know, speaking to you. They felt like you were safer, but also it's kind of sad because it's like, man, this mask that, you know, cisgender heterosexual males wear, how we, you know, in the ways that we knowingly and unknowingly uphold patriarchy, that we're not even a safe space for each other. It's like, I can't be my full self with another dude, you know, who is, again, cis het, because of judgment, fear, all these things. But with women, I could be my full self, or with your man, I could be my full self. And, you know, just acknowledging that and just hoping that one day, you know, men, you know, or people, just no matter how they identify, can get to the place where we're just open and accepting and you know, not afraid to be our full selves, mask off. Really love us.
I think that's hard though, right? Because on the one hand, it's definitely, you know, as Bell Hooks tells us, it's obviously on men to kind of figure out what the hell is going on with gender and masculinity. But at the same time, like, gender is learned, right? We're born with the sex, but gender is learned. And the reality is, for so many of us, we learn gender through our mothers, right? So we talk about like men and toxic masculinity, but oftentimes that masculinity is actually crafted, and beaten into you by your mama, your grandmamas, or your aunties, or what have you. You know, stand up straight, put some bass in your voice, stop playing with dolls. And like, we often talk about these coming from men, but many of us come from single parent households or only women focused households. And so much of the gender that we learn actually comes from women. And it's policed, especially for straight people, via the women they date or want to appear attractive to. So I think that like we do this interesting thing where we're calling out men, as we should do. But I think that also we have to remember that gender and like toxic masculinity is a community performance that is mandated and scripted. And when you step off that stage, the things that you lose are very, very real. And I also think that like women do a thing with gender too, right? Whereas they don't allow themselves to occupy particular types of spaces and relationships. And so I think that like we're all dealing with gender and gender itself being toxic. So I don't even know that I believe so much in the kind of toxic masculinity or whatever we say about femininity. I think that gender in and of itself is a really kind of crafty and toxic prison to exist within.
I agree. You know, it's a social construct and it's harmful, indeed. Yeah. And I think that, you know, humanity as a whole would be better off if we just rejected it and got rid of
Seriously.
I agree. So, and again, as I'm listening, I'm relating in so many ways. And one of the ways that I'm relating is like when you mentioned that you didn't speak to your mother for a year. I went through that when I came out as polyamorous. You know, I came out as polyamorous back in 2017. And unfortunately, it ended my 15-year relationship to my now ex-wife. And it caused a huge ripple, you know, in the family dynamic. And, you know, it was hard. Man, it was hard. I get chills just talking about it because you mentioned you step off a certain stage, you lose a lot. And I lost a lot. You know, I lost a lot by coming out and standing in that truth, which I suppressed for so long once I came into that understanding about myself. And unfortunately, I came into that understanding of myself 5 years into a monogamous marriage. So, man, I wish I would have learned that about myself earlier, but you know, that's life. But when that happened, amongst a lot of fallout from family, friends, etc., and being othered, I had a fallout with my father, and I literally had to block him and didn't talk to him for over a year. You know, as a result, you know, of people thinking that I was choosing this, and they just couldn't wrap their minds around me really being able to be introspective enough to come into this understanding about myself and test it out in terms of my mental, you know, capacities to really figure out if this is true for me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But so yeah, you know, I know it's different than what, you know, queer people face. But, you know, it's something I can kind of, you know, empathize with. I faced it in this like relationship orientation concept. Yeah.
And I mean, in some ways that almost feels more, you know, and I don't know if we can say something is more or less traumatic, but just hearing that feels even more traumatic to me, that, you know, you're in your adulthood, right? You're not like a 16-year-old that is trying to figure out, this is the way my body feels, do what you want with it. But you're in adulthood, you're in a marriage, and like people that are seeing you this whole time, maybe even being codependent, interdependent on you, are cutting you off or trying to publicly discipline you over the ways in which you choose to date or be in relationship with people. Not their gender or their sexuality, but the fact that you're no longer in this partnership and you're exploring what partnerships work for you. I mean, like, that is just so crazy. And I think that for me, that didn't really happen with the non-monogamy part of me. And not part of we go back and forth to non-monogamy, monogamy, because like it's whatever works for you in the moment. But at the same time, like I think that my family was like, you're queer, so you just gonna do whatever type of crazy stuff you gonna do. So we
Right.
accept that. But like this idea of like, you know, like your father not talking to you and then just kind of thinking about like, what is that about? Do you think I'm a bad representation of you? It's like to experience that as an adult versus as a youth is just like a completely different destabilizing situation. So I just can't even imagine. I might have blown up the city. I don't know what I would have done.
I appreciate it. I appreciate that acknowledgement and that empathy. So if you don't mind, could you define queer, especially, you know, instead of like in contrast to gay? Can you define that for?
Yes. So for white LGBT community has tried to bastardize the word queer and make queer and gay mean the same thing, or to make queer be an umbrella term, which it is not, and it will never be. Okay. So gay is just, you know, someone, generally a male, right? These are generally gender specific terms that is attracted to the same sex, right? That's essentially just what it is. Whether you date people or not, whether you are even engaged with sex or not, that's right. On you. It's just about the physical attraction. Maybe there's not even a romantic attraction, right? Yeah. Maybe you're bi and you're attracted to men and women. Maybe you're attracted to trans people as well, but that's a whole other conversation. Queer is, generally speaking, it's both a sexual identity and it's a political identity. Mm. So when we think about like the queer rights movement, we think about pre-Stonewall, the idea wasn't that, you know, LGBTQ people are supposed to be just like straight people. That's the kind of gay rights argument. The normative, we're just like you. We want to get married. There's nothing different about us. Queer people are demanding this idea that people actually deserve to be treated equitably in society. So queerness, by definition, is this idea of being strange or weird or outside of the mainstream. It's a critique of the norm, right? Oh. So by virtue of being queer, right, you're not trying to ingratiate yourself into this kind of normative society. So queer people are generally those that have a political orientation that is actually about a deep critique of the system as we know it, and this idea that people are wholly different but still deserve equitable, you know, treatment and equitable opportunities. And not equal, right, but deeply equitable. So you'll often see, you know, the queers, they might be having crazy hair colors, they might be really doing something that's different and stands out, and that's fine. But the idea is that it's not just this kind of performative queerness that we hear today, kind of in no shade to the homie Lil Nas X, but this idea that like, okay, you're doing this and that, and you're in pink, and you're doing this innovative videos, nice. But what's the political commentary? So queerness is generally a sexuality plus a political commentary. And there's this kind of argument now that straight people can be queer, which is like, okay, girl, whatever you say. But generally queerness is about a kind of political ideology and a political stance and a standing outside of the norm and critiquing systems of power as they currently exist. But it's kind of gotten subsumed by white LGBT people who have kind of like taken this term to now be a kind of overarching term so people aren't held accountable to their politics.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very thorough explanation, and I get it. I get it. So, as we transition into going deeper into our theme, and how that, you know, plays into the work that you do in the world and the ways that you show up in terms of providing care, you know, through your work and the ways that you model, you know, identity and how that, you know, influences, you know, change. I want to speak to, you know, our theme of popular culture and how it, you know, relates. And when I think about popular culture, I think about the systems, the ideas, the beliefs, the social norms, et cetera, that a majority of people in society have embraced and accepted. And for this podcast, the Grow Dialogue podcast, we seek to amplify the voices of people like yourself who have stories and initiatives that we feel like need to be a part of larger popular culture conversations. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, I know that you have the platform and the identity of being Black queer. Mm-hmm. So you touched on it, you explained what it was. What I'd like to know, I guess, is I love how you said that Black queer it speaks to the intersectionality of you identifying as Black and queer and how they are not separable. They're one and the same. One of the things that I've noticed that has really bothered me when I'm having conversations with people is when, and let's say I have, friends, family, I hear people say things like, let me see, the LGBTQ movement or the gay movement, they are like harmful to Black people or something like that, or they don't care about Black people, and or just various statements like that. In my mind, I'm like, but don't you realize that there's a lot of, LGBTQ plus people who are quote unquote Black or of African descent or African American, etc. Like they separate it, and I never understand why people speak in the ways like quote unquote LGBTQ plus people are different than quote unquote Black people. Have you heard that line of thinking? Do you know what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I mean, I hear that all the time, particularly on like toxic spaces like Clubhouse, some radio spaces, some like Twitter club rooms or space rooms, whatever they are. And yeah, so I hear that kind of all the time. It's really, really interesting. And I think it speaks, to one, the miseducation of Black folks. The idea that like you can be a Black person living today and not know the ways in which Black queer people have affected your life and made it so that you could even be free. Right. Like, I mean, when people say things like this, I think about like, wow, do you not know James Baldwin?
Facts.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, did you not know that Malcolm X was bisexual? Like, did you not know that the man that organized the whole March on Washington was a gay dude who was being profiled and harassed by the FBI and really lost his whole profession for organizing that for you? So you don't have to drink at a colored only fountain? Like, we think about someone like Pauli Murray, who was actually the legal architect of the civil rights movement, mentored Thurgood Marshall and wrote the new Jane Crow article. And like basically was, what's her name, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's mentor as well. So she both broke down the color line and the gender line. Like, when I read about these things, I'm like, you not know Langston Hughes? You talk about the Harlem Renaissance, you not know they were all queer? I started hearing these things, and it's heartbreaking to understand that like my people have no idea who they are. No clue. And it also is crazy to me because we understand that 13% of the population, 13% of the population are queer people. Like, and that's any racial group. And so if you think about that, well, I would say LGBTQ people. And if you think about that, that means 13% of Black people. So that means 1 out of every 13 members of your family is some type of gay, bisexual, gender non-conforming, whatever person, and they don't get the space to exist in your mind or in your presence because of this level of ignorance. So I wonder about the type of harm that you're doing to other people in your family that you say you love, to the children that come next, maybe even to yourself, and the deep level of ignorance that speaks to, that you don't even know your own history. Yet you have a platform to say something crazy. Yeah, that is just wild to me. It's crazy. I love you were just like, it's interesting, and then it's just wild and it's crazy, and I think that's the only place we can put it, right? So the sad thing is, when you said, do you not know your history, and the reality is a lot of people don't, because it was erased, it was hidden, they weren't, we didn't come up being told that, some of these people that you mentioned were, on the LGBTQ plus spectrum in some way, because again, they just weren't allowed to exist for so long. They were written out of history. So now we live during a time where we're seeing, LGBTQ plus people written into the modern day stories. And it's so rattling to people now. So now we have popular music where, some of the lyrics and the themes and videos, et cetera, are now showing what's always existed. We have TV shows that, I would say probably is coming to my awareness probably in about the last 10 years or so, where we're now starting to see these type of relationships being shown in popular culture in that way on TV and movies, et cetera. And it's, again, that's very jarring for so many people, and people are like, oh, it's the gay agenda and, all these things. Hollywood is trying to turn, X, Y, Z, us, queer. Like, it's just the madness in my mind, when I see these things and people say these things, it's wild. But then there's a side of me that says, you know what? Unfortunately, they don't know. So what can we do to continue to, increase that awareness,
and kind of do the things we do and kind of have empathy for those people. Do you think those people have empathy?
I don't know what they deserve. I would say, because on the one hand, there is as we were talking about earlier, as I was talking about earlier, I think a lot of people are resistant to queerness and, gender freedom, whatever that may look like, gender expansiveness, because if they take that seriously, if they take the idea that you are so-called naturally, I don't really care what nature means, right? But naturally who you are, then that also, again, forces them to look in the mirror, right? And think about the ways in which they were beaten into being who they are. A lot of people will sit here and they will talk about, to your point, this kind of gay agenda, or they're forcing it upon us. I don't want my kids watching this, they're going to become gay. And there was a post on Facebook today that really just had me cackling. But this lady was like, y'all grew up watching The Cosby Show, all these Black TV shows with these married families, and how come you still single and you can't keep a partner? You got 11 kids, and it's no shade. I don't think you need to have a partner to have kids, but why didn't that rub off on you?
Right.
The success didn't rub off on you. Getting a job didn't rub off on you. Being educated and reading books didn't rub off on you. But being gay will? So what is really going on here? Which one is the contagion? Because the math isn't mathing. So I don't know that I have a lot of empathy for people. I feel sad for them. But I very rarely have empathy for people that are doing harm. You know what I mean? Because I'm more concerned about the little child in the living room that hears their daddy saying this crazy stuff on Clubhouse, right? And now knows that if my father knows who I am, I could be harmed, or I could be abandoned, or I could be unloved, I could be beaten, and now having to hide within themselves. And so that's the part we don't talk about. We talk about with police, which is really important. We talk about racial profiling. And I wrote this article maybe a year or two ago about sexual profiling, and not just the ways that white people do it, but the ways that Black people sexually profile each other, right? And what does it mean to be a Black queer child within a Black cishet household? To mean that you're literally hiding within yourself in the place where you're supposed to be the safest. So how do you even know what safety is? How can you have a consensual, loving relationship when you actually are at war with your own body? You're being taught to police your voice. How high is your voice? Where do you put your hand? What is your wrist doing? How are you standing? How are you walking? And this as a child, by the people you love, and you're worried that your body might betray itself? And so when I think about that, I think about straight Black people as the police. So I don't got a lot of empathy for, the dude that killed George Floyd. I ain't got empathy for him. Right. You knew what you was doing. And if you didn't, if you regarded people as human beings, it wouldn't matter what they were doing. You wouldn't have killed them.
Yeah, it would never got to that level.
It never got to that point. And I think that in our culture, the murder is not just physical, because we see Black trans women getting killed, average lifespan of 31 or 32 years old in America. But also we see the emotional violence and the disregard, right, that happens. We know that Black LGBT youth have the highest homeless rate in America. That's disgusting. Why are children homeless? You know what I mean? And so when you ask me about empathy, I'm kind of more rageful, because how dare you?
I respect it. I respect it. So getting into more and deeply into Black queer and how that impacts how you, well, let's say this, you coined the term, and now, others attribute it to you. And I imagine that it's been something that has given life, and to a lot of people, and helped a lot of people feel seen. Can you speak more to Black queer and as a platform, and how you use that platform to do your care work?
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I actually came up with this term when I was in, I think, my freshman year of college, and I was in, again, Christina Sharp's class, Memory for Forgetting, or Black Feminist Theory 1 to 2. And I had gotten sexually assaulted. And so we were trying to figure out, how do I mentally work through this while not dropping out of school? Again, first generation high school graduate, college student. I'm not losing my college over this. Is what I've been working for. And I started this blog on Tumblr, right, called Black Queer Flow. And I started on Tumblr, and then it just started getting all of this traction. I think my junior year, I moved to WordPress. I was getting 50 or 60,000 views a day, or readers a day. And then it was just I started having other Black queer people come and write for the space. And this was all a little website I'm running out of my college dorm. You know what I mean? And it started a lot of well-known, writers that we know now. You people might know, Harry Ziad wrote for us for a little bit. There's a lot of great people that have come through this space, And so for me, it's really been a space where like, how do I bear witness to my own life? And also, how do I give other Black queer people and then some other queer people of color the space to witness themselves and do that in a way that's also intellectually rigorous, right? There was a series that Harry Ziad and I did when Harry was writing for their blog, Race Baiter, and I was writing for Black Queer Flow, where we actually did like a kind of brother-to-brother series of letters between each other that were published, right? Every other week. And I ended up putting it in my first book. But it's just this idea that you are not alone, number one, and Black queer people exist across space and time. And so when I started getting emails from folks in South Africa being like, I love your blog, why isn't it up anymore? Where have you been? It's beautiful and it's heartbreaking, but also it's great to know that type of impact. So what I've tried to do with this is move from just having the blog. Now I just started the Center for the Study of Black Life and the Law at a Mitchell Hamline School of Law. And it's the first institution in the country that's focusing just on Black people in the law as it's written and as it's enforced. So I'm really happy that even there has a Black queer focus at its heart. So the platform for me has been about bearing witness to the ways in which the law and society orders and disorders Black queer living and dying. And it does that in various ways, both through policing and the law that's written, but also the ways in which public benefits are doled out, the ways in which families police children, right? The way that healthcare resources are doled out. And so it's been really, really important for me to kind of do this work and then to think about the law, think about society through the lens of a Black queer person. Sure. We think about with the law, we'll say the reasonable person standard. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways you'll see that most often is if someone gets stopped by the police, did you feel free to go? And the standard is, well, would a reasonable person under the circumstances feel free to go? And no surprise to you, the reasonable person under the circumstances is always an upper middle class white man who the police basically work for. But if you're a Black trans woman, do you ever feel free around the police? Right? And maybe it's a Black trans woman. Do you feel like the police they're about to stop you? So do you run? Right? Maybe it was reasonable for you, understanding the history of policing with folks that look like you, move and love like you. Maybe it was reasonable to run. Right. But it wouldn't have been reasonable to run for the upper middle class Black white man because he wasn't gonna get shot no way. You know what I mean? So I've been trying to kind of intervene in the law and try to think about what does it mean to be reasonable and getting that underlying anti-Blackness and anti-Black queerness out of there and exposing it for what it is.
I love it. I love it. So you've chosen to go the route of law. Mm-hmm. I can share with you as someone who, I personally consider myself an anti-oppression, I would say anti-oppression activist in the past, but now I expanded to say, I got away from the word activist and I say I'm an anti-oppression organizer, facilitator, and content creator. And one of the things that I've noticed about myself and my work and how I move through the world is I tend to reject systems that I believe are harmful and where I believe harm is at the foundation of, that particular system. And also from learning systems thinking through my doctoral studies and then self-studying it afterwards, I'm someone who believes that, reform isn't the solution. I believe creating new systems that have designed to harm out is the solution. I believe people living the reality of a world that we want to see in terms of each system and in the ways they intersect is the solution, creating those models, et cetera. However, when I think about the path that you've taken in academia and in law, it seems like you've chosen to say, I want to make an impact from within the current systems that exist. Can you speak to that differing approach and how you may see the two?
Yeah, so I don't even see it really as a differing approach for me, because for me, it's always both and. I'm an abolitionist at my core, but I also work in law, right? So it's very interesting. But I also think that in order to abolish something, you must first master it. And so for me, I understand that there are going to be generations of lawyers that are coming out of school and they're being taught a white supremacist narrative of what tradition, history, culture, precedent, right? Even what has a legal standing and can be viewed by justices or judges is, right? And I have to disrupt that because I have the knowledge to do that. And so I don't really see myself as really necessarily working within a system. The question for me is always, where do you disrupt it, right? And so I'm always trying to expose the law for the lies it tells. And I always ask the question when I'm in class with my students, and tonight I'm teaching advanced critical race theory, but I always ask them, okay, so here's the law, where's the lie? Like, whose lives are being lied about? Who's being erased here? And what are the stakes for that? So for me, it's actually trying to hold the law to account to actually what we mean when we say, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For who? Sure. At what cost? But when I'm not at work, I'm also in these streets, right? Organizing for a different abolitionist future, and also doing creative writing on that scale. So I think that, like, for me, I'm just the type of person where I use every tool that I can wield. And I think that that's an ancestral practice. I think about, when our people came over on those first slave ships, they actually took whatever they could to survive. Or maybe it's jumping over the ship, and even to do that, right? In a place where you don't speak the language of all these different looking Black folks, ain't even the concept of Black yet. But you made a way out of no way. And so I think that, like, that is the kind of the carry on tradition that I try to rise up to. So wherever I'm at, I'm going to be doing that type of work.
I love it. I love it. And I love the both and I believe it's necessary. Even as someone who tends to be an outside the system person, I believe that there are people who have that both and. I believe that both are necessary. I'm going to say it like that. I believe that operating anywhere on the spectrum of complete abolition and turning your back on systems and creating the new, or those who are straddling both, I think is all necessary. They don't have to be in competition with one another. So let me ask you this. This is, as we get near our close here, another question I'd like to ask all of my guests is there a story that inspires your work? Is there like a story you can point to that has been inspirational to you, that really guides you and has inspired you in some way?
I mean, there is a story, and I really hope their book is a little bit delayed, but I hope it comes out shortly. Goodness, his name is Channing Joseph, and he's writing a book about William Dorsey Swann. William Dorsey Swann, thanks to Channing Joseph, is known as America's first Black drag queen, first drag queen period, and they were an enslaved person, born in the 1830s. And there's a story of them, wearing this amazing dress in DC in the, I think it's like 1850s, 1860s, or what have you. And they're having a ball, something that people might relate to in seeing Pose, but also more of actually a tea party type of thing. And so all of the people are there and they're dressed up in what we would maybe call drag, or maybe even cross-dressing. It's really not clear whether this is a performance or their whole identity, but they're having this tea party at their house, and the police come and try to raid them. And so as everyone else is running out the back door, William Dorsey Swann throws themselves down the stairs at the police and tells them, "You will not enter. You are no gentleman, sir." And so we think about the Stonewall riots as the first time people are kicking back, but you have a person who was born in slavery, who has been described in the newspapers at the time of being a regal woman, dressed as fine as the queen in white silks, right? These trailing dresses. How do you get the money to even make this, right? In the wake of slavery, right? And they were sentenced to jail all the time. It was like, okay, it is what it is. I'll be back, And so this kind of early Black queer resistance really, really resonates with me, particularly when they didn't even have a language to describe themselves.
Powerful. So can you share your vision for the future as it relates to your platform, your Black queer platform, as you think about what the future, let's say as your work continues to manifest and you have more reach and more success, what is your vision for the future in that?
Yeah, I mean, I would think I would like to, and not to sound like too much hubris, I don't know what the vision for my own work looks like in that way, but I do have a vision for the impact. I hope that, by the time that, I go on to the ancestors, go on to glory, whatever you want to call it, that I have the same impact as someone like a Maya Angelou has, right? That I've left, a kind of a trail, right? A kind of litany for survival, as Audre Lorde calls it, that Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks have. That maybe you don't always just agree with me. Maybe you don't even know what the hell I'm talking about, but something that I've done has left you in a way where you can actually move from surviving to living to thriving, right? Where Black people and queer people of color and Black queer people, and really anybody, can pick up a text that I've written or see a speech that I've given or see the intervention I've done with law and actually create a grammar to describe their own lives, where people are empowered to bear witness to themselves and also testify on behalf of other folks without fear, or even with fear, and do it anyway. So I just hope that, when I go on and die and stop having to pay rent or a mortgage or whatever, that my ancestors proud, that I've left more love than harm in my wake. And that's really all that I can hope for.
I love it. I love it. So, as we close out, I want you to, share with our listeners and watchers how they can follow you. And before that, though, I just want to say that, it was probably, 3 years ago now that I first encountered one of your posts on Facebook. And that's how I began to know you. And I remember someone shared something that you wrote, and it was so powerful. And I had to reach out in your inbox and said, hey, can I send you a friend request? I would like to follow you. And, you are one of, and probably the only male presenting queer person that lives out loud without a mask, that's not afraid to show, all the different elements of who you are, whether it's your professional or whether it's your personal, that I've had the privilege of following, that has expanded my mind on how, queer people move through the world and the challenges, their joy, their fears, their concerns, their life. And for me, because I'm someone who is intentional about wanting to expand my worldview in those ways, following you was just, it was impactful in a very, very major way. So I just want to say thank you for being brave and having the courage to be who you are and to be yourself, especially as a person of African descent, a Black queer person who says, I'm me, I love me, this is who I am, and I'm gonna live it out loud and proud. And that has helped shape my worldview and given me more language, giving me more empathy, helped me expand my tolerance. If I've had to unlearn the toxic things that I learned, around homosexuality throughout my life. And so thank you. Yes. And for those who, want to do the same, and follow you in whatever capacity you would like to share, please let them know how.
Yeah, and also thank you for that affirmation. It's always a blessing to be a blessing. And also, again, credit to my mother, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and aunties, and all those folks, the queer folks that came before me. But I would say if you want to follow me, the easiest way to do is probably Twitter. The handle is BlackQueer, BLAQUEER, Flow. And you can follow me there. It's the easiest way. I'm pretty responsive most of the time.
Awesome. So we will put that into the show notes. And again, I know that you're very busy, as a law professor and all the other things that you do in the world. For you to carve out a little time here to be with us, I don't take it lightly. And, sending you much gratitude and much love for who you are as a person. I can't wait to continue to follow, all of your work. And, for all of our listeners, I appreciate you all being here with us once again. And until next time, I love y'all. Peace.
Thanks for tuning in to the Grow Dialogue podcast. Remember to join our Grow Dialogue community to continue the conversation, activate authentic dialogue, and to get exclusive content, discounts, and special offers on curated artwork and music from independent artists from the Americas. Check out our show notes for more info and visit www.growdialogue.com to join our live events. Don't forget to support us on Patreon. We really appreciate your support.